On the morning of January 21, 1824, a British governor named Charles McCarthy stood on the bank of a jungle stream and ordered his military band to strike up God Save the King. He believed the 10,000 men gathered in the trees across the water were bluffing. Some of their chiefs, he thought, would hear the anthem, lose their nerve, and defect before a shot was fired. The drums that answered him were not surrender. They were Ashanti war drums. Within hours, McCarthy was dead, and his skull, rimmed in gold, became a royal drinking cup. That single afternoon should have taught the British Empire everything it needed to know about the Ashanti. Instead, over the next 76 years, British commanders kept walking into the same lesson in different uniforms. They called the Ashanti primitive. They called Kumasi, the Ashanti capital, a cluster of mud huts. They called the next campaign a formality. And 4 more times, the jungle answered back. This is the story of an empire that kept insisting the next war would be the easy one, and kept paying in blood to find out it wasn't. Most people outside West Africa have never heard the word Ashanti used the way British officers used it in the 1800s. As a warning, on the Gold Coast, in what is now Ghana, the Ashanti Empire had built something the British didn't expect to find in the West African interior. It had a professional standing army organized into companies and wings, with officers who drilled volley fire the way European regiments did. It had a capital city with named streets, indoor plumbing, and a population that 19th century visitors estimated in the tens of thousands. And it had a way of defending its territory that no cannon in the British arsenal could fully solve. 100-yard log stockades sunk into the forest floor, manned by riflemen the British couldn't see until they were already shooting. None of that stopped London from treating each new war as a quick fix. 5 times between 1823 and 1900, British forces marched into Ashanti territory, expecting a short campaign and a tidy headline. 5 times, the terrain, the discipline, or the disease got there first, and sometimes all 3 showed up at once. Here's what makes this story worth the full runtime instead of a 2-minute recap. Each of these 5 wars was fought by a different generation of British commanders, with better rifles, better maps, and better intelligence than the war before it. And almost every single time, they still walked in believing the fight ahead of them would be easier than it turned out to be. This is the story of those 5 wars, in order, and of the one thing the British never managed to take, no matter how many soldiers they were willing to spend trying. The Ashanti Empire was less than a century and a half old when the British started underestimating it. It had been founded around 1701 by Osei Tutu, a king who unified a loose collection of Akan chiefdoms under a single sacred symbol, the Golden Stool, said to hold the soul of the entire nation. Osei Tutu didn't just build a kingdom, he built a war machine. And it is worth spending a few minutes on how that machine actually worked, because it explains almost everything the British got wrong later. The Ashanti army was organized into companies called Asafo, each led by an officer called an Asafohene, who answered up a chain of command that ended with the king himself. In battle, the army split into 3 wings: a right wing, a left wing, and a rear guard, so it could advance in the center while the flanks curved around to encircle an enemy from both sides. Ahead of the main force went scouts, professional hunters who knew the forest floor the way a city dweller knows his own street, and their job was to find the enemy long before the enemy found them. The weapons were not spears and shields. By the early 1800s, the Ashanti fought mostly with trade muskets, nicknamed Long Danes after the Danish merchants who first supplied them, bought at the coast in exchange for gold and captives. When lead shot ran short, Ashanti soldiers loaded their muskets with nails instead, and it worked well enough that British officers noted it without much comment. What genuinely surprised European observers was the discipline. One 19th century writer, describing an Ashanti advance, said the soldiers marched in perfect order, guns held at exactly the same angle, and fired in volleys on command, something he had not seen from any other African army. That kind of coordination, fire, reload, advance the second line, fire again, was not improvised. It was drilled. Ahead of every army marched a separate corps of scouts, sometimes numbering 2,000 or 3,000 men on their own, drawn from professional hunters who could read a forest floor the way a sailor reads weather. Their job was to locate an enemy, probe his position, and pull back before committing to a real fight, feeding word to the wings behind them. Combined with the three-wing encirclement system, this gave Ashanti commanders something most European armies of the period didn't expect from an opponent in this part of the world. Real battlefield intelligence, gathered before the shooting started, not after. None of it came cheap, and none of it came from nowhere. The Ashanti Empire sat on some of the richest gold-bearing land in West Africa, and its kings taxed every ounce of it moving through their territory, along with the kola nuts and captives that flowed down the same trade routes toward the coast. That wealth paid for muskets, paid for the standing companies of soldiers who didn't have to farm between wars, and paid for a level of central organization that most neighboring states simply couldn't match. It is worth remembering later, when a very different set of British officials start worrying about who else might get their hands on that same gold. None of it would have held together without the Golden Stool itself, and the founding story behind it is worth pausing on, because it explains why Britain's later demands over that one object provoked a war and not just an argument. Ashanti oral tradition holds that the stool didn't come from a goldsmith's workshop. According to the story, Osei Tutu's chief priest, a man named Okomfo Anokie, called it down from the sky in a black cloud of dust, and it landed gently in the king's lap, in front of the assembled chiefs. Whether or not anyone in that crowd believed the stool had literally fallen from heaven, the political effect was real. From that day forward, no single clan could claim the throne belonged to them alone. It belonged to the stool, and the stool belonged to the whole nation. And then there was Kumasi itself. In 1817, a British envoy named Thomas Bowditch spent months in the city and came home stunned. He described an oblong city about 4 miles around, with streets so wide and straight that 4 of the main ones ran half a mile long and up to 100 yards across. Kumasi had 27 named streets by his count, growing to 50 by the 1880s, and 77 separate wards, each one home to a different trade. Goldsmiths in one quarter, umbrella makers in another, coffin makers in a third. Houses had toilets, some of them upstairs, flushed daily with boiling water. Streets were swept, and the red clay walls polished. Bowditch put the population at roughly 100,000 people. He had expected, in his own words, to find something closer to a village. What he found instead embarrassed the prejudices he'd arrived with. The royal palace complex, called the Aben, sat at the heart of the city, with a wall running 200 yards along one side of its main square. Bowditch described carved wooden lattice windows inside it, some of the woodwork framed in thin sheets of gold. This was not a hut with a fence around it. It was a seat of government, with its own treasury and its own bureaucracy, trained secretaries, who kept written records of court proceedings and diplomatic correspondence, in a kingdom most of Europe assumed couldn't read or write at all. None of this makes the Ashanti Empire some lost paradise. It grew wealthy the same way most of its neighbors did in that era, on gold and on the slave trade, selling captives taken in war to European merchants at the coast. Its state religion involved human sacrifice at royal funerals, a practice the British would later use, not entirely dishonestly, as a justification for war. This was a real, complicated, powerful state, not a myth and not a monster. That complexity is exactly what got lost every time a British commander sat down to plan an easy campaign against it. Because behind that wealthy, organized capital sat the real defense, the one that would humble army after army. The forest itself, and what the Ashanti had built inside it. At key points along the roads into their territory, Ashanti engineers built log stockades, sometimes running over 100 yards long, built from heavy parallel tree trunks driven into the ground. Artillery shells passed straight through them without bringing them down. Behind those walls, riflemen waited in numbers no British scout could count from a distance. Some of these walls ran more than 100 yards without a break, built from heavy parallel trunks driven deep enough into the ground that a Royal Artillery shell could pass straight through one and come out the other side, splinters flying, with the wall still standing. Getting past a position like that meant walking into it, in the open, under fire from men who had been waiting there for days. Add to that a climate that killed European soldiers with malaria and yellow fever faster than any Ashanti musket could, and you have a country that was, on paper, exactly the kind of enemy a colonial power should have taken seriously from day one. The British did not. It would take them the better part of a century and 5 separate wars to find out what those stockades and that forest could actually do. The first war started, as these things often do, with a small insult and a governor who thought he understood the situation better than he did. In 1821, Britain took direct control of its Gold Coast forts and sent Sir Charles Macarthy to run them. Macarthy was new to the region, more interested in buying out rival Dutch and Danish trading posts than in learning who his neighbors actually were, and he arrived believing British interests required breaking Ashanti power outright. In 1823, after the Ashanti executed a soldier serving in a British garrison for insulting their king, Macarthy declared war. He wrote home that the Ashanti were blustering, unprepared for a real fight, and confident of an easy win. Word reached Cape Coast in early January that the Ashanti were on the move, and Macarthy hurried north with whatever men he could gather quickly. They marched through mud that came up past their knees in places, and slept exposed to torrential rain, arriving at the frontier exhausted before they had even seen an enemy soldier. He was wrong on every count. When his scouting force of about 600 men first clashed with an Ashanti detachment, 10 British soldiers were killed and 39 wounded in a single skirmish, and the British still retreated. Macarthy pressed on anyway. He split his roughly 2,500-man army into separate columns, planning to converge on the enemy from different directions, and led the smallest column himself. 80 regulars, 170 colonial militia, and 240 Fonte allies, along with a captain, an ensign, surgeon, and his colonial secretary. On January 20, 1824, that column camped by a tributary of the Pra River, out of contact with the other British forces. The next afternoon, they heard the enemy approaching. It was not the small advance guard Macarthy expected. It was the main Ashanti army, roughly 10,000 strong. This is where Macarthy made his fatal miscalculation. Believing some Ashanti chiefs might defect on the spot, he ordered his band to play the British national anthem, loud enough to carry across the water. The Ashanti response was war drums, closing the distance. Fighting began almost immediately. The two forces were separated by a stream about 60 feet wide, and the Ashanti tried to cross it on felled trees, while the British fired on them from the opposite bank. For a while, the position held. Then the ammunition ran out. The bearers carrying Macarthy's reserve gunpowder had fled into the bush at the first sound of gunfire, and when a handful of supply crates finally reached the line, 3 of the 4 turned out to be packed with macaroni, not ammunition. As British fire slowed and stopped, the Ashanti crossed the stream and closed to hand-to-hand range. Most of the Fonte militia broke and ran. The soldiers who stood their ground were overwhelmed. Macarthy was wounded trying to fall back, and accounts differ on exactly what happened next. Some say a second shot killed him, others that he chose to die rather than be taken alive. Either way, he did not survive the afternoon. His ensign, Wetherell, was killed defending his body. His secretary, Williams, was taken prisoner, and later described being held for months in a room alongside the severed heads of Macarthy and Wetherell, kept as trophies of the victory. Macarthy's skull, rimmed in gold, became a drinking cup used by Ashanti rulers on ceremonial occasions. It would be years before the British recovered even the silver cutlery looted from his baggage train. By the time the wider campaign wound down, British and Allied losses stood at 176 dead and 677 wounded. A catastrophic toll for what McCarthy had reported to London before Nsamankow as a coming formality. In an odd twist that Ashanti oral tradition still records, the reigning king, Ose Bonsu, died in Kumasi that same day and was succeeded by his nephew, Ose Yao Akoto, who kept the pressure on. Later that year, Ashanti forces beat a joint British and Denkira force again at the Battle of Afutu, and came close to storming Cape Coast Castle itself, though the fortified British headquarters held. For 2 years, both sides rebuilt. Britain assembled a much larger coalition of coastal allies, terrified of Ashanti power after Nsamankow. In 1826, a combined British and African force of around 11,000 men met a similarly sized Ashanti army at the Battle of Dodowa, and this time, the British had something new. Congreve rockets, an early and genuinely frightening weapon that hadn't been seen on that battlefield before. The explosions, the trails of smoke, the wounds they caused, broke Ashanti morale in a way musket fire hadn't, and the army fell back toward Kumasi. It took until 1831 for a formal peace, and the man who finally closed the deal was Captain George McLean, a low-ranking officer with almost no formal backing from London, and plenty of skeptics among the coastal merchants who doubted he had any business negotiating anything. He did it anyway. The terms were almost gentle, given everything that had come before. 600 ounces of gold, worth somewhere around $2.5 million at today's gold prices, 2 royal hostages, and Ashanti recognition of 2 smaller kingdoms' independence. Peace held along that border for the next 30 years. The first lesson of the Anglo-Ashanti Wars was already written by 1831, if anyone in London had cared to read it. Victory over Ashanti was possible. It was also slow, expensive, and nowhere close to the formality a confident governor had promised his superiors 8 years earlier. Nobody learned that lesson permanently. They would have to learn it 4 more times. 30 years of peace ended in 1863 over something almost mundane. A fugitive, an Ashanti subject named Kwesi Gyana, fled across the Pra River into British-protected territory, and a large Ashanti force crossed after him in pursuit. Skirmishing broke out along the border almost immediately. British, African, and Indian troops responded, and at a clash near Bobakuma, the British force under Major Cochrane took an early beating before reinforcements steadied the line. It was the same story that had played out at Nsamankow 4 decades earlier, in miniature. A smaller British detachment meeting a larger Ashanti force and getting badly mauled before anyone more senior arrived to fix the situation. Britain leaned heavily during these wars on the West India regiments, soldiers recruited in the Caribbean who were assumed to handle West Africa's climate better than troops fresh from England. During this Second War, though, even they were kept mostly to outpost duty rather than sent into serious combat, a quiet sign of just how little confidence anyone had left in this campaign by that point. But here's what actually decided this war, and it wasn't muskets, it was fever. As the campaign dragged on with neither side landing a decisive blow, sickness tore through both camps. The colonial governor asked London for reinforcements and was refused. His West Indian troops, meant to be more resistant to tropical disease than European soldiers, were withdrawn anyway once illness thinned their ranks past usefulness. By 1864, the war simply stopped, with no treaty, no ceremony, and no side willing to call it a defeat. The border stayed exactly where it had been before the first shot. It is a strange thing to call a stalemate a humiliation, but that's closer to the truth of it. An empire that had spent decades building the most powerful military machine on Earth had just failed, for the second time, to defeat a West African kingdom outright. And this time, it hadn't even lost a dramatic battle to explain the failure. It had simply run out of healthy soldiers. The real killer on that campaign wasn't an Ashanti bullet. It was the climate itself, and no rifle upgrade was going to fix that. Less than a decade later, Britain would send its most celebrated general to finish what McCarthy had started, with a plan built around exactly that problem. By 1871, Britain had bought the Dutch Gold Coast, including the port of Elmina, territory the Ashanti considered partly their own. Ashanti forces invaded the new British protectorate the following year, routed the coastal Fonte allies, and attacked Elmina itself, though the assault failed. London had seen enough. This time, there would be no amateur colonial governor leading the charge. In August 1873, the War Office appointed Sir Garnet Wolseley, already one of the rising stars of the British Army, to command a full punitive expedition. He was given roughly 2,500 British regulars, several thousand West Indian and African troops, and the full attention of the London press, including 2 war correspondents who would go on to considerable fame in their own right, Henry Morton Stanley and G.A. Henty. This war was going to be watched. Wolseley understood something McCarthy never had. The real enemy wasn't the Ashanti army, it was the 160 miles of dense forest between the coast and Kumasi. So before he fought a single battle, he built a road. Royal engineers cut and cleared the route mile by mile, bridging every stream with timber, bamboo, and rope, including a major crossing of the 60-yard-wide Pra River, using prefabricated pieces shipped from England. By the time the campaign ended, they had built 237 separate bridges. Every 10 miles or so, they raised a fortified camp of their own, complete with its own stockade walls, cleared from the surrounding bush. An almost exact mirror of the defensive structures the Ashanti had been using against invaders for a century. The empire that mocked Ashanti fortifications as primitive had just copied them for its own protection. Wolseley even brought along steam-powered traction engines, nicknamed steam sappers, meant to haul supplies up the new road on their own. They broke down constantly in the mud and never pulled their weight. One of the few pieces of Victorian technology on this campaign that didn't live up to the hype surrounding it. Once the road neared Ashanti territory, Wolseley sent an ultimatum demanding the release of Fonte prisoners and the surrender of the Ashanti Queen Mother and heir, terms designed to be refused. They were refused. Skirmishing began in late January 1874, and on January 31, the two armies met at the village of Amoaful. The Ashanti commander that day, a general named Nsamankow, had chosen his ground with real skill. Forest cover, ridges overlooking swampy bogs the British had to wade through under fire, and concealed firing positions his troops used to devastating effect. British soldiers advanced in a square formation through thick bush, taking fire from an enemy they often couldn't even see, and by some contemporary accounts, nearly 1 in every 4 British soldiers who fought that day was hit. What broke the Ashanti line in the end wasn't rifle fire. It was British artillery and rocket tubes, weapons the Ashanti had no answer for. By the time the fighting stopped, roughly 2,000 Ashanti soldiers were killed or wounded, against 4 British dead and 194 wounded. Nsamankow himself died in the battle. Even British officers who fought against him wrote afterward that his tactical judgment and his courage had matched anything they'd seen from a European general. 2 days later, at the village of Ordasu, the last organized Ashanti resistance tried to block the final approach to the capital. British engineers cut a road straight into the village clearing, and the Black Watch Regiment led the assault, forming square while their pipers played a marching tune and the men went in with bayonets fixed. The Ashanti line broke and scattered into the trees. It was a smaller, faster fight than Amoaful, but it was the one that finally opened the road to Kumasi. Kumasi fell 4 days later, on February 4, but not in the way anyone expected. The city had already been abandoned. British troops walked into an empty capital, and what they found stunned some of them. A royal palace complex so large and so well stocked that soldiers reported finding rows of books written in multiple languages inside it. Hardly the residents of the savages London newspapers had been writing about for months. Wolseley's men demolished the palace with explosives and burned much of the rest of the city over the following 2 days, before marching back toward the coast ahead of the coming rainy season. The campaign's real cost tells its own story. Of the roughly 300 British casualties in the whole war, only 18 died in actual combat. 55 more died of disease, meaning for every 10 British soldiers who died on that campaign, roughly 7 were killed by fever and dysentery, not by an Ashanti bullet. Even in a war Britain won decisively, the jungle was still doing more damage than the enemy army. The peace terms, signed at Fomena that July, demanded 50,000 ounces of gold from the defeated king, Kofi Karakari, worth something in the neighborhood of $200 million measured against today's gold price. The treaty also demanded an end to Ashanti human sacrifice and guaranteed open trade roads between Kumasi and the coast, terms London would cite for years afterward, as proof the war had been a moral mission and not just a military one. In practice, the Ashanti never paid anywhere close to the gold demanded. Records suggest only about 4,000 ounces actually changed hands. Wolseley went home a hero anyway, promoted and celebrated. The officers who'd served under him, going on to fill senior commands across the empire for decades. Henty turned his dispatches into a book called The March to Kumasi. Stanley, already famous for tracking down the missionary David Livingstone a few years before, filed reports that made Wolseley a household name in Britain before the campaign had even finished. But strip away the celebration and look at what victory had actually required. A purpose-built road, 237 bridges, artillery, rockets, a telegraph line, and a campaign that still killed more of its own soldiers through sickness than through combat. That was not the formality anyone in London had promised the public. It was, once again, an expensive lesson that Ashanti resistance had a real cost attached to it, and the empire had still not destroyed the kingdom it claimed to have conquered. Kumasi would be rebuilt. The Ashanti state, weakened and humiliated, was not gone. For 20 years after Wolseley's campaign, Ashanti power declined on its own terms. A civil war in the 1880s split the kingdom's leadership and left Kumasi further battered. By the 1890s, Britain had a new worry. French and German colonial expansion was closing in on Ashanti territory from the west and east, and nobody in London wanted to lose the region's gold and rubber to a European rival. Britain demanded Ashanti accept formal protectorate status. The reigning king, Prempeh I, refused to give up his sovereignty and sent a delegation all the way to London offering trade concessions instead. It made no difference. Britain had already decided on a military solution before that delegation even made it home. In December 1895, Colonel Francis Scott marched out from Cape Coast with Maxim guns and field artillery, arriving in Kumasi the following month. Prempeh, reading the situation correctly, ordered his people not to resist. Not one shot was fired in the entire campaign, but the jungle collected its toll regardless. 18 European soldiers died of disease, and roughly half of the entire expeditionary force fell sick before it ever left Ashanti territory. Among the dead was Prince Henry of Battenberg, the husband of Queen Victoria's own daughter, Princess Beatrice, who contracted malaria on the march and died aboard the ship carrying him home, before he'd even made it back to England. One of the officers commanding the expedition's native levy was a young major named Robert Baden-Powell, who would spend the next decade turning his experiences in colonial campaigns like this one into something else entirely. 11 years later, he founded the Boy Scouts. Baden-Powell later published his own account of the campaign, and in it he laid out what he believed the expedition had accomplished: an end to human sacrifice, a stop to slave raiding, protection for smaller neighboring tribes, and collection of the war debt Ashanti had owed since 1874. He also argued that sending a smaller force would have meant real fighting and real bloodshed, and that the size of Scott's column was exactly what had kept the peace. Whether that reasoning holds up is a fair question to ask. What isn't in question is the timing. Britain moved on Ashanti in 1895, mostly because it feared losing the region's gold and rubber trade to French and German rivals pressing in from both sides. And the moral case came together afterward to justify a decision that had already been made. Prempeh was arrested, deposed, and exiled to the Seychelles along with his senior chiefs, punished in part for never having paid off the 50,000-ounce gold fine Britain had levied back in 1874, still sitting unpaid 2 decades on. London called the whole affair a complete and bloodless success, and in the narrowest sense, it was. No British soldier died from an Ashanti weapon, and the king who'd once ruled from that vast palace complex was now a prisoner on an island in the Indian Ocean. But an empire that measures success purely by its own casualty count is going to miss something important, and Britain missed it badly here. A war with no battle isn't the same thing as a war with no resentment. The Ashanti hadn't been defeated in the field this time. They'd simply been told not to fight, by a king who was then taken from them anyway. That distinction was about to matter more than anyone in the colonial office understood, because the next war wouldn't be started by a British general with an ultimatum. It would be started by a British governor with astonishingly bad judgment, and a queen mother who had already lost more than she was willing to lose again. By 1900, Kumasi had no king. Prempeh was still in exile, and in his absence, one object still carried the full weight of Ashanti sovereignty: the Golden Stool. It wasn't a throne. No one, not even the king himself, was permitted to sit on it. Ashanti belief held that it contained the sunsum, the living soul of the entire nation, and it was treated accordingly. Carried on its own cushion, kept resting against a wall so it would never touch bare ground, brought out only for the most sacred ceremonies. On March 25, 1900, the British governor of the Gold Coast, Sir Frederick Hodgson, arrived in Kumasi to hold a public assembly with the surviving chiefs. 3 days later, standing before them, he made a demand that would end British rule over Ashanti in a way no army ever had. He told the assembled chiefs he represented the paramount power in their country, and that as such, he was entitled to sit on the Golden Stool himself. "I am going to sit on it," he told them. To the men in that room, the request wasn't just arrogant. It was closer to a declaration of war on their nation's soul. Their king was gone. Their army was a shadow of what it had been in Wolseley's day. Fear settled over the meeting, and for a moment, it looked like the chiefs might simply comply. By 1900, they had good reason to feel powerless. 4 years of British occupation had stripped much of the old army's firepower, and the man who might have led any resistance, their king, was thousands of miles away on an island most of them had never heard of. Then Nsamankow stood up. She was the queen mother of Ejisu, a district within the Ashanti Confederacy, and as the traditional guardian of the Golden Stool, its fate was hers to answer, for more than anyone else in that room. She had already paid a price in this conflict. Her own grandson had been exiled to the Seychelles alongside Prempeh in 1896. Watching the chiefs hesitate, she rose and shamed them for their fear, invoking the great Ashanti leaders of the past and daring the men present to compare themselves to that legacy. Her words, remembered and retold ever since, ended with a promise: "We will fight till the last of us falls on the battlefield." The men followed her. War began within days. Estimates of the force she assembled vary depending on the source, ranging from around 5,000 fighters to considerably more. But whatever the true number, it was enough to lay siege to the British fort in Kumasi, trapping Hodgson, his wife, several hundred Hausa soldiers of the West African Frontier Force, and hundreds of allied civilians inside its stone walls. For more than 3 months, Ashanti forces cut the telegraph lines, blocked the food supply routes into the fort, sniped at anyone who showed themselves on the walls, and ambushed the relief columns Britain kept trying to send. Inside those walls were roughly 300 to 400 Hausa soldiers of the West African Frontier Force, Hodgson and his wife, a handful of British officials, and around 700 African civilians who had taken shelter there when the fighting began. Food ran low. Disease set in. For weeks at a time, nobody outside Kumasi knew for certain whether anyone inside the fort was still alive. It was, in almost every respect, the same style of warfare that had humbled McCarthy 76 years earlier. Use the terrain, use surprise, use knowledge of the ground the enemy didn't have. The Ashanti had no artillery to match the fort's defenders, but they didn't need it. They only needed to make the siege expensive enough and long enough that Britain would have to answer with real force to break it. Britain did. In late June, a wave of reinforcements reached the area strong enough to let Hodgson and a small party slip out of the fort and make it back to the coast, though the garrison he left behind kept holding on under fire. It wasn't until July 15 that Colonel James Wilcox arrived with a full relief column of around 1,400 men and finally broke the siege for good, freeing a garrison that had been under attack for roughly 3.5 months. The war didn't end there. Through the summer and into the fall, British flying columns swept the surrounding districts, hunting down what remained of the Ashanti resistance, fighting skirmishes at places like Obasa, and storming the fortified town of Kokofu, where an officer named Charles Mellis earned the Victoria Cross for his part in the assault. By December 1900, Ashanti herself had been captured, along with roughly 15 of her senior commanders. Total British and Allied casualties across the whole campaign are usually put at around 1,000. Ashanti losses are harder to pin down with any precision, but historians generally describe them as running into the thousands. A brutal toll from Maxim guns turned on warriors who had no equivalent weapon of their own. Word of the siege, and of the toll it took to break it, reached London and split public opinion in a way the earlier wars never had. In Parliament, the colonial secretary defended Hodgson's demand for the stool outright, arguing that the bloodlessness of the 1896 campaign was itself what had provoked this uprising, since the Ashanti had never been made to feel the weight of a real defeat. Other members mocked the entire premise of the mission with open sarcasm. A year after the fighting ended, one MP stood up and criticized the government's handling of the whole affair by describing, in blunt terms, the scale of the dead left scattered around the fort at Kumasi. Not everyone in Britain, in other words, thought there was anything to be proud of in what had just happened. Ashanti and her fellow captured leaders were exiled to the Seychelles, joining Prempeh, who had now been gone from home for 4 years. She would never see Ashanti again. She died in exile in October 1921. In January 1902, what remained of Ashanti independence was formally folded into the British Gold Coast colony, closing a chapter that had opened with a governor's skull turned into a drinking cup nearly 80 years earlier. But here is the detail that makes this war worth remembering above the other 4. The one thing Ashanti and her chiefs had actually gone to war to protect, the Golden Stool itself, was never found. It stayed hidden through the entire conflict, and for years afterward, resurfacing only by accident when road workers stumbled onto it long after the fighting had ended, and even they stripped it of some of its golden ornaments before it was properly recovered and restored. Britain had spent 5 wars, thousands of casualties, and the life of a queen's own son-in-law trying to bring the Ashanti Empire to heel. In the one moment it mattered most, the empire it had just annexed still managed to keep its most sacred possession completely out of reach. That is the real ending to the story the mockery never saw coming. The British eventually won every one of these wars, on paper. But it took them nearly 80 years, 5 separate campaigns, and losses that dwarfed anything the men who started this conflict ever expected, to conquer a kingdom they'd spent the entire time calling primitive. And the single object that conquest was supposed to prove, a king's stool sitting under a foreign governor, they never actually got. Prempeh I spent 28 years away from home. First in Sierra Leone, then in the Seychelles alongside Ashanti and the other exiled chiefs. In 1924, Britain finally allowed him to return, not as a king with political power, but as a private citizen. When his ship reached the coast, thousands of people, African and European alike, came down to the beach to watch him land. He traveled on to Kumasi by special train, greeted the entire way by crowds who had waited a generation for this. The Golden Stool resurfaced years after the war ended, found by road workers who had no idea what they'd stumbled onto. It had been stripped of some of its gold ornaments along the way, but it was recovered, restored, and returned to its rightful place. In 1935, it finally played the role it had always been meant for, present at the ceremony that installed Prempa II as the new Asante, the sacred center of a nation Britain had spent 5 wars trying to convince itself didn't deserve the fight it put up. In 1957, the Gold Coast became Ghana, the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to win independence from colonial rule. The Ashanti region and the city of Kumasi became part of that new nation. The Asante still holds a ceremonial throne in Kumasi today. The Golden Stool still rests nearby, untouched, exactly where it always belonged. If there's one thing this story should leave you with, it's how often primitive turns out to be a word empires use, right up until the moment it stops being true. The Ashanti weren't an outlier either. Just 6 years before Ashanti's rebellion, on the other side of the continent, another army that Britain had badly underestimated handed a colonial force one of the worst defeats in the history of the empire, in a single afternoon, at a place called Isandlwana. If you want to see how a different kingdom turned British overconfidence into catastrophe even faster than the Ashanti did, that's the video to watch next. 5 wars, one empire that never stopped being surprised, and a wooden stool that never once touched the ground it was supposed to symbolize. That's the real story behind the headline your history class probably skipped.